They arrived with the cross in one hand and the sword in the other. When the Portuguese landed in the lands we now call Brazil, they encountered native peoples, dense forests, and generous nature. But the goal was never coexistence. It was to exploit, profit, and control. Portuguese colonization quickly organized itself around a cruel economic logic: to extract as much wealth as possible in the shortest time possible. And for that, labor needed to be abundant, obedient, and above all, cheap. They began by enslaving indigenous peoples, but soon realized it was more profitable to import Africans. Not only because of their physical resilience to the climate, but also because there was already a consolidated system of capture and trade on the west coast of Africa, fueled by tribal wars, kidnappings, and corruption. It was then that Brazil inscribed itself into the map of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. Already in the 16th century, the first slave ships began to cross the South Atlantic, bringing kidnapped Africans from different ethnicities, languages, and cultures. The journey was brutal. The ships, known as tumbeiros, carried hundreds of people in chains, stacked on top of one another in filthy and suffocating holds. Many died before even arriving. Those who survived disembarked in Salvador, Recife, or Rio de Janeiro, their names erased, their freedom stolen, their humanity denied. African slavery in Brazil was not a historical mistake. It was a meticulously planned project designed to enrich the metropolis at the cost of millions of black lives. With the expansion of sugar mills, the slave trade intensified. The colonial economy depended entirely on forced labor. Africans were seen as pieces, classified by age, strength, and ethnic origin. They were sold at public auctions as if they were merchandise. Women, men, children, no one was spared. The logic was simple and cruel. The more production increased, the more people needed to be enslaved. The sugar plantation owners knew it, the merchants knew it, the Portuguese state encouraged it and profited from it. And the African people were the crushed bodies beneath this system. Slavery in Brazil officially began with the first slave ships in the year 1530. And in the following centuries, it spread across the entire territory. From the plantations in the Recôncavo Baiano to the gold mines in Minas Gerais, through the cities under construction in the southeast and the coffee plantations in São Paulo's interior, the enslaved arm was the engine of production. Contrary to what many believe, slavery was not limited to the countryside. Entire cities were built and sustained by black labor, from the paving of streets to the kitchens of the great houses, from the water carriers to the bricklayers, from wet nurses to market vendors. The black presence was dominant, yet made invisible in textbooks and denied in official memory. To justify this systematic violence, a racist ideological discourse was created. The Catholic Church collaborated with the slave-owning mindset, claiming that Africans needed to be civilized and converted to Christianity. Skin color came to be associated with moral and intellectual inferiority. That's where racism as a structure was born. It wasn't enough to enslave. Society needed to be convinced that it was just, necessary, even divine. And it worked. For centuries, the image of the black person was constructed as something subordinate, dangerous, dirty, exotic, domesticable. This narrative was absorbed by the elites, by the law, by the culture, and tragically, by the Brazilian people as a whole. The slave trade was not just a moral issue, it was a highly profitable business. Portugal, England, the Netherlands, and Brazil profited immensely from this macabre commerce. Ships left Europe with weapons, cloth, and alcohol. They arrived in Africa and exchanged these goods for people. Then they crossed the Atlantic with the captives and returned with sugar, gold, and more profits. It was a cycle of horror disguised as progress. Brazil alone received about 40% of all Africans enslaved and brought to the Americas, an estimated total of 5 million souls. This statistic is frightening, but what it hides is even more brutal. Each number represents a life interrupted, a family torn apart, a culture violated. While Europe grew and industrialized, here Brazil consolidated itself as the largest slave territory in the modern world. Slavery shaped our economy, our land structure, our social habits. It is at the root of the inequality that still persists today. This is not a distant past. We're talking about something that lasted more than 300 years and whose effects still define who has access to land, education, and power. Many of the monuments, churches, and mansions we admire in historic cities were built at the expense of human suffering. The luxury of some was born from the blood of others, and yet we learned in school that slavery was just a phase, as if it was something fleeting, as if it ended without leaving deep scars. We must face the truth. Slavery in Brazil was the greatest crime ever committed on our soil, a crime legitimized by the state, blessed by sectors of religion, supported by the elite, and naturalized by the people. And as long as this story is told superficially, as long as books hide the statistics and silence the names, Brazil will remain trapped in its invisible chains. But to understand the scale of this system, we need to look closer at what was behind it. How did the slave trade industry work? Who profited from it? And why did Brazil become the main destination for this humanitarian tragedy? The trafficking of enslaved Africans was not improvised. It was a meticulously designed system with defined routes, strategic alliances, and profits calculated down to the smallest detail. For more than 3 centuries, this machine of exploitation moved entire empires, and Brazil was the beating heart of this mechanism. Between the kidnapping in Africa and the auction on the port docks, there was a cycle of violence as cold as it was efficient. The Atlantic trade turned human beings into merchandise, sea routes into death corridors, and ports into centers of dehumanization. It was a cruel logistics system, operated by merchants, financed by bankers, and tolerated by the laws of the time. Everything began on the African continent, especially in the regions we now know as Angola, Congo, Benin, Nigeria, Guinea, and Mozambique. There, entire peoples were captured during tribal wars, ambushes, or simple raids, coordinated by African intermediaries serving European powers. Local kings and chiefs, seduced by firearms, cloth, and liquor, handed over their own brothers in exchange for power. Corruption and despair shaped the dynamics of the villages. The capture was brutal. Children, women, the elderly, all were dragged in chains to coastal forts, where they waited weeks or months until the slave ships arrived. There, the process of dehumanization had already begun. They were branded with hot iron, had their heads shaved, and were registered as numbers, not as people. The slave ships, known as tumbeiros, were true floating coffins. Overcrowded, with terrible ventilation and no sanitation, they caused epidemics, scurvy outbreaks, dysentery, and scabies. People were stacked in stifling holds with just enough space to lie on their sides. Chains prevented any movement, and those who got sick or died were simply thrown overboard. The Atlantic crossing, called the Middle Passage, could last from 30 to 90 days. During this period, Africans were fed flour, dirty water, and sometimes whipped to maintain order. The mortality rate was extremely high. It is estimated that for every 100 people boarded, around 20 died along the way. But for the traffickers, this was part of the calculation. It was an acceptable loss in view of the colossal profits at the final destination. Upon arriving in Brazil, the captives were taken to slave markets, public places where they were displayed, touched, interrogated, and auctioned like animals. Salvador, Recife, Rio de Janeiro, and São Luís were some of the main centers of this practice. Buyers assessed musculature, teeth, age, and even the docility of the captives. Women were often chosen for domestic work and sexual abuse. Young men for heavy labor in the fields and mines. Children, in turn, were domesticated from an early age, creating a continuous cycle of servitude. The profits from each piece sold were immense. A healthy enslaved person could be worth the equivalent of several heads of cattle or a large tract of land. The trade was so profitable that it became the main engine of the colonial economy. Portuguese merchants grew wealthy, authorities collected taxes on every enslaved person sold, and sugar plantation owners expanded their estates. It was a system in which all white people profited and all black people lost. And contrary to what many believe, the Portuguese crown did not merely allow the trade, it regulated it and profited directly. There were licenses for ships, taxes on sales, and even officials appointed to oversee the slave depots. Everything was carried out with apparent legality, but behind the mask of one of the greatest injustices in human history. Even when other nations began abolishing the trade, like England, in the year 1807, Brazil continued. The smuggling of enslaved Africans increased in the following decades with clandestine routes, bribes to authorities, and forged documents. Smaller ships, called ghost ships, transported hundreds of hidden Africans in order to evade British inspection. Only by the mid-19th century was the trade effectively suppressed, but by then millions had already been brought over. And the most painful part is that for many of them, arrival in Brazil did not mark the end of suffering, but only the beginning. They were not just numbers. Every man, every woman, every child brought from Africa carried a story, a language, a religion, an identity, and all of that was erased in the name of profit. Africans were forced to forget who they were and become nothing more than labor. Many were given Christian names, forbidden to speak their native tongues, and compelled to adopt European customs. This symbolic violence, the destruction of ancestral culture, was as cruel as the physical beatings. That is why, even today, the struggle for memory, identity, and reparations is so urgent, because that past has not passed. It was embedded into the present as a collective trauma that still manifests in Brazil's racial and social inequalities. The question few dare to ask is, who profited from all this? The answer is clear. Aristocratic families, merchants, European banks, the Portuguese crown, the church, and even part of the local elite who rose socially thanks to slavery. These profits financed buildings, public works, churches, universities, and even political campaigns. Meanwhile, Africans and their descendants received nothing but pain, erasure, and misery. To this day, the heirs of the slave-owning system still hold land, power, and privilege, while the descendants of the enslaved continue fighting for space, voice, and dignity. But the pain was not limited to the crossings or the auctions. The true extent of the horror unfolded in the daily life of the plantations, the mines, the great houses, and the streets of colonial towns. It was there, in the forced sweat and daily spilled blood, that the slave system sustained itself. That's why, in the next chapter, we'll dive into the everyday life of enslaved Africans in Brazil, to understand what it meant to live, resist, and try to survive in a world built to destroy them. If the trade was the beginning of hell, life on the plantations was its daily confirmation. Most Africans brought to Brazil were destined for the sugar fields, where they faced a routine marked by pain, extreme exhaustion, and a total lack of rights. From sunrise to sunset, men and women were forced to cut cane under a scorching sun, carrying tons of stalks to the mills. There were no breaks, no protection. Wounded hands from machetes were common, backs bent long before their time. And rest was a luxury that almost never came. When sugar production slowed down, many were transferred to gold and diamond mines. There, the work was even more brutal. Captives spent their days inside narrow tunnels, at risk of cave-ins, without air, without light, with nothing but hope they wouldn't die that day. Others served in the great houses, as cooks, wet nurses, personal servants, laundry workers. But don't be fooled into thinking domestic service was easier. Many black women were sexually assaulted, constantly humiliated, and forced to feed and care for their masters' children while their own were left behind, forgotten, or even sold to other plantations. Nights brought no relief. After exhausting days, Africans were locked in the senzalas, cramped dark spaces with little ventilation and filled with disease. They slept on dirt floors, piled together like cattle. Often entire families were purposely separated to prevent bonds of affection or any chance of organization. The violence was physical, but also emotional. The goal was to break the spirit, to erase identity, to make enslaved people see themselves only as machines of labor. At any sign of fatigue, slowness, or resistance, punishment followed, and it was brutal. Stocks, chains, branding irons, paddles, public whippings. Many were tied to whipping posts in village centers for everyone to see, a warning of what happened to those who dared to disobey. The black body became the stage for a performance of punishment. Pain turned into discipline. Humiliation became a tool of control. Children learned early that silence was survival, that crying was useless, that speaking too loudly could be deadly. Even amid this terror, resistance never ceased. It wasn't only seen in escapes or rebellions. Though these were frequent, there was also a quiet daily resistance expressed through work songs, small nighttime celebrations, orally passed recipes, gestures and whispers in African languages. Many captives hid sacred objects, made discreet offerings to their ancestors, and secretly preserved their spiritual traditions. Faith was a weapon against dehumanization. Afro-Brazilian religiosity, which today is seen in toreros and popular festivals, was born from the courage to keep the soul alive, even when the body was being whipped. Music was also a form of resistance. African drums, even when banned, echoed in the hearts and footsteps of those who still dared to dance. Capoeira, disguised as play, taught self-defense and unity. Stories shared in circles, passed down through generations, kept alive the memory of kings, queens, warriors, and African gods. Even when everything around them claimed they were inferior, many Africans found ways to declare, "We are more than you see." The Great House and the slave quarters were not just physical spaces, they represented the abyss between two worlds. On one side, luxury sustained by blood, on the other, scarcity sustained by hope. And this contrast formed the foundation of Brazilian society. The structural racism we see today has deep roots in that oppressive daily life. The idea that black people belong only in spaces of servitude was planted there during centuries of slavery, watered with prejudice, made official by law, and passed down through generations. In the cities, daily life was not much different. Urban enslaved people did everything: carried water, cleaned streets, sold goods in markets, worked on public projects, played instruments at elite parties. Even so, they were constantly monitored, pursued, and punished at the slightest sign of autonomy. Runaway announcements in newspapers described fugitives as escaped pieces, detailing scars, clothing, and skills. It was institutionalized human hunting. Freedom was a crime, escape an intolerable challenge to the colonial order. And yet, in every generation, a new group of black men and women found ways to resist, survive, and dream. Hope did not die, and this spirit of struggle reached its peak in the Quilombos, communities formed by runaway enslaved people who built a new society based on freedom, solidarity, and justice. They refused to accept the fate imposed on them. They fought back. They lived beyond the chains and challenged the masters with courage and wisdom, but this part of history is rarely told, because it shows that slavery was not accepted, it was resisted, and that even in the shadows of suffering there was light. In the next chapter, we will explore these spaces of freedom built amid oppression. We will dive into the history of the Quilombos and understand why they became a symbol of black resistance in Brazil. Not every captive accepted slavery in silence. In every region of Brazil, centers of resistance emerged, and among the most powerful were the Quilombos, communities formed by Africans and Afro-Brazilians who escaped from plantations, mines, and great houses to organize a life of freedom. Escaping was an act of courage, resisting an act of revolution. In the Quilombos, there were no masters or chains. There were black people reclaiming their dignity with their own hands, building from scratch a space where life was defined not by the whip, but by community, faith, and ancestry. The most famous of these refugees was the Quilombo dos Palmares, located in the Serra da Barriga, in what is now the state of Alagoas. For more than 90 years, Palmares resisted dozens of attacks from colonial troops. It was a truly independent black nation, made up of thousands of inhabitants. Its most well-known leader, Zumbi dos Palmares, became a symbol of African resistance in Brazil. Born free within the Quilombo itself, Zumbi understood the value of freedom like no one else. He grew up hearing stories of suffering, but also of glory, of a people who would not bow, of men and women who preferred to die fighting rather than live on their knees. Palmares was a complex structure with agriculture, animal husbandry, military organization, and preserved cultural traditions. It was living proof that African people were neither savage nor incapable, as the colonizers insisted, but capable of creating strong, organized, and united societies. This, of course, was a threat to the slave-owning order. For plantation masters, Palmares was an intolerable danger. The existence of such a powerful Quilombo encouraged other captives to flee. Fear spread among landowners. What if more black people realized it was possible to live without obedience? That's why Quilombos were constantly attacked. Troops were funded by landowners, governors, and merchants. The goal was to destroy every hut, every shred of hard-won freedom. But with each attack, the Quilombolas learned to defend themselves better. They set up ambushes, used their knowledge of the land, and created alert systems. When they couldn't resist, they fled to form new Quilombos in even more remote areas. It was a cycle of constant rebuilding, because the will to be free was stronger than any military siege. Zumbi led Palmares with wisdom and courage. He refused pacts with the Portuguese, faced betrayal, and fought tooth and nail until the end. In the year 1695, he was captured and killed. His head was cut off and displayed in a public square, but his death did not destroy the ideal he represented. On the contrary, Zumbi became a legend, a symbol of force. To this day, November 20th, the date of his death, is remembered as Black Consciousness Day, a landmark in the struggle for memory, recognition, and historical justice in Brazil. But Palmares was not the only one. Quilombos arose all over the territory, in the interior of Bahia, in the forests of Minas, in the backlands of Maranhão, in the jungles of Pará, and on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. Each had its own story, its own structure, its own struggle. Some lasted for months, others for decades. In many cases, Quilombolas managed to establish commercial relations with neighboring communities, exchanging goods and information. This coexistence showed that even under persecution, there were possible paths of collective construction between free black people and other marginalized populations, such as indigenous peoples and poor white settlers. In addition to permanent Quilombos, there were also urban rebellions, uprisings by enslaved Africans in the cities who organized riots, poisonings, arsons, or mass escapes. The most well-known was the Malay Revolt, which took place in Salvador in the year 1835. The Malays were literate African Muslims who organized a rebellion with a strong religious and intellectual foundation. Although the revolt was crushed, it proved that Africans in Brazil maintained a high level of organization, faith, identity, and a strong sense of justice. Colonial violence could try to erase all of that, but it never succeeded. The Quilombos and Black rebellions were, therefore, direct responses to slavery and racism. They were legitimate forms of insurgency, of self-determination, of affirming the humanity of an entire people. They proved that black people were not passive, that the history of slavery is not just a narrative of pain. It is also a narrative of courage, of resilience, of dreaming. And still, even after centuries of struggle and resistance, the freedom that eventually came did not arrive as a victory of the black people. It was signed on paper, from the top down, without debate, without reparations, without support. In the next chapter, we will talk about this so-called abolition that did not free. We will understand how, after more than 300 years of forced labor, the black population was left to fend for itself. Without land, without wages, without protection, and with the weight of an entire country on their shoulders. May 13th of the year, 1888. This is the date officially celebrated as the end of slavery in Brazil. But what really happened that day? The signing of the Golden Law by Princess Isabel abolished slavery abruptly, without compensating the freed black people, without offering access to land, education, housing, or any social integration policy. It was a freedom declared on paper, and in practice, it meant abandonment. Instead of celebrating, many black people wept, not because they were no longer enslaved, but because they realized they were now alone. After more than 300 years of slavery, the Brazilian state washed its hands. There was no national inclusion plan. No structure was created to repair centuries of exploitation. What followed was an illusion of freedom, where the freed were thrown into the world with no resources, no opportunities, and no rights. Many slept in the same places where they had worked in chains. Others wandered through cities in search of work, but faced rejection, prejudice, and violence. The promised freedom turned out to be a new kind of prison, now invisible, but just as cruel. The great plantation owners, on the other hand, were spared. They kept their lands, their wealth, and their political power. Some were even compensated by the empire, but the freed black population received nothing. Without land to farm, they were forced to accept menial jobs or working conditions that closely resembled their former enslavement. Many began living in tenements, in the outskirts, in vacant lots, laying the foundation for the urban favelas that would grow in the following decades. The major Brazilian cities began pushing black people out of their centers, hiding their presence and history in the hills and ghettos. Social exclusion began to be reinforced by a new discourse: eugenics. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, many white intellectuals began to promote racist theories, claiming that Brazil would only progress by whitening its population. They encouraged mass European immigration, while black and indigenous people were marginalized. Laws were passed to prohibit or criminalize cultural practices of African origin, such as capoeira and Afro-Brazilian religious rituals, linking black culture to criminality. In schools, African history in Brazil was erased. In churches, their saints were silenced. In politics, their participation was blocked. Racial marginalization became institutionalized. The Republic itself, proclaimed in the year 1889, just 1 year after abolition, completely ignored the racial issue. The new constitution made no mention of the enslaving past, offered no reparations, and did not recognize black people's right to full citizenship. The land ownership structure remained untouched. Landowners continued to dominate the land, while the freed were turned into informal workers, without documentation, without protection, without dignity. Freedom for black people was a gift wrapped in invisibility. Thus, structural racism began to form as a disguised continuation of slavery. The difference now was that the whip had turned into silence. The slave quarters had become the outskirts. The whipping post had been replaced by the neglect of authorities. Slavery had been formally abolished, but the logic that sustained it remained alive. To this day, the descendants of the enslaved occupy the worst positions in access to health, education, employment, and decent housing. The heroic narrative built around Princess Isabel also deserves to be questioned. For decades, the Brazilian education system taught that the princess freed the slaves out of kindness. But this version ignores the protagonism of black resistance, of Quilombos, of revolts, of religious brotherhoods, and of black abolitionist organizations that were active in the streets long before any royal pen. The Golden Law was the result of unbearable pressure. The black movement, though repressed, had become politically active, questioning the system, founding newspapers, organizing escapes, and rescuing captives. Abolition was not a favor. It was a victory wrested with blood and sweat, but never recognized as such. Moreover, May 13th became an official date, but one without memory. For a long time, textbooks celebrated the end of slavery as if it were a noble act of the monarchy, while ignoring the fact that Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. That says a lot. Brazil clung to slavery until the very last moment because it was the foundation of power. Even with the world condemning the practice, the country resisted, negotiated, delayed. When it finally signed abolition, it was too late to save its honor, and too early to call it justice. That is why many black activists and thinkers reject May 13th as a symbolic date. They prefer November 20th, the day Zumbi dos Palmares was killed, as the true landmark of the black struggle in Brazil. Because Zumbi represents protagonism, resistance, and pride, Isabel represents silence, erasure, and false benevolence. And history needs to be told with courage, even when it dismantles comfortable myths. But if black people were abandoned by the monarchy and ignored by the republic, what was left to them? The answer lies in their daily struggle for survival, for rebuilding identity, and for finding belonging. In the next chapter, we will explore how the descendants of the enslaved faced the challenge of existing in a country that granted them freedom but never truly accepted them. We will discuss the legacy of racism in modern Brazil and how it still shapes who is allowed to dream and who is forced to resist. Freedom without dignity is just another form of oppression, and that is exactly what happened to the millions of black people freed in post-abolition Brazil. Without land, without education, without support, they were pushed to society's margins. And the worst part, the system restructured itself to maintain this exclusion subtly, continuously, and institutionally. This is what we now call structural racism, a form of racism that needs no offensive words because it is embedded in laws, streets, schools, wages, and statistics. The consequences of this system are visible to this day. In any social data analyzed, income, access to health, quality education, sanitation, life expectancy, public safety, black people are always in the worst positions. This is not by chance. Racial inequality in Brazil did not arise randomly. It is a direct result of the slaveholding legacy. For more than 300 years, the black population was forced to work for free, barred from studying, from owning property, from building wealth. When abolition came, there was no compensation, and opportunities continued to be offered only to a white minority. In the job market, black workers were pushed into informal, precarious, and poorly paid positions. The few public schools that existed in the following decades were not prepared to welcome a population with a history of exclusion. Illiteracy among black people persisted for generations. Many had to choose between studying and working to survive. And when they tried to access higher education or public positions, they were blocked by a system that claimed to be equal, but in practice favored those who were already at the top. This false idea of meritocracy helped perpetuate a cycle of poverty and exclusion. Another myth that must be confronted is that of racial democracy. For decades, Brazil was sold as a country where all races live in harmony. But this narrative served only to mask reality. It was constructed to hide racism, silence complaints, and avoid debates about reparations. By declaring that everyone is equal, the official discourse ignored the material, social, and historical conditions that systematically disadvantaged black people. The result: a society where racism is not acknowledged, but is practiced every day. Police violence is one of the most brutal expressions of this racism. Black youth, especially in the outskirts, are constant targets of violent stops, torture, arbitrary arrests, and summary executions. The black body is seen as suspicious even before any evidence. Favelas are treated as war zones, and police operations result in deaths that are rarely investigated. Meanwhile, the media often reinforces stereotypes that link skin color to crime, creating a collective imagination where black people are always guilty, even when they are the victims. The emergence of favelas also has direct roots in slavery. When freed people were expelled from urban centers, they began to settle on hillsides, slopes, and abandoned lots. Without support from the state, they built their homes with whatever they could find, forming marginalized communities neglected by public authorities. These spaces, often absent from official maps, became strongholds of resistance, culture, and life, but were also stigmatized. Favelas came to be seen as symbols of crime, when in reality they are the result of the historical exclusion of a people who never had fair access to the city. Even in the face of so many adversities, black people resisted. Black consciousness was built slowly, with great sacrifice. In toreros, in samba circles, in samba schools, in remaining quilombos, in social movements, a new narrative began to emerge. One of pride, of ancestry, of identity reconstruction. The memory of those who fought was recovered. Black heroes, once ignored by history books, began to be celebrated. And a new generation began to demand a voice, a place of power, and public policies for reparations. The implementation of racial quotas in universities and public service exams was one of the most significant victories of this movement. For a long time, it was said that quotas create inequality. But in practice, they are a way to correct historical injustices. It's not about privilege. It is about justice, about offering minimum conditions so that black people can access what has always been denied to them. And the results have been clear. The number of black youth in higher education has increased. New voices are emerging in politics, in science, in literature, and in the arts. It is still not enough, but it is a beginning. The anti-racist struggle has also expanded into the symbolic realm. The celebration of natural hair, African-inspired clothing, African-rooted music, ancestral names and black bodies, all of it has become part of a collective affirmation of identity. Saying "I am black" stopped being a burden and became a banner of resistance, belonging, and future building. And this cultural shift has scared those who have always been at the top, because when black people recognize themselves, organize and grow stronger, the oppressive system begins to tremble. But the struggle is far from over. Racism reinvents itself. It takes on new forms. It infiltrates algorithms, banks, school curricula, fashion editorials, advertising campaigns. That is why it is essential to keep the memory of slavery alive, not as a closed chapter, but as an open wound that must be treated with truth, justice, and reparation. Brazil will only begin to heal when it fully acknowledges what it has done and what it continues to do. And that is why the next chapter is so essential. We're going to talk about the rebirth of Black identity in Brazil, about the recovery of ancestry, culture, faith, and self-esteem. We're going to see how, even after everything, Black people still dance, sing, create, lead, and inspire, because the greatest victory of resistance is to exist, with pride, with beauty, and with power. After centuries of silencing, something began to change. And it was not the system that offered space, it was Black people who claimed it. 21st century Brazil is beginning to hear voices that were silenced for a very long time. Voices that carry in their skin, rhythm, hair, and faith the heritage of an entire continent. Voices that echo from slave quarters, from Quilombos, from favelas and schools. Voices that do not ask for permission, they demand recognition. Because being Black in Brazil has never been just a color. It has always been a struggle, a resistance, and above all, an identity. Rebuilding that identity was a long and painful process. Racism tried to destroy Black self-esteem in every detail. In the mirror, in language, in beauty standards, in textbooks. And even so, the memory of the ancestors crossed through time. The music, the dance, the flavors, the hairstyles, the drums, all carried the mark of those who, even enslaved, never completely bowed. And that memory turned into strength. Today, more than ever, we see a generation of young Black people proudly saying, "My hair is my crown, my story is my root, and my body is sacred territory." Afro-Brazilian culture has gone from marginalized to a symbol of power. Samba, born among persecuted Black people, became a national treasure. Capoeira, once criminalized, is now taught in schools and practiced around the world. African-based religions like Candomblé and Umbanda resisted persecution and are now recognized as pillars of Brazilian spirituality. Every terreiro, every circle, every drumbeat is an act of affirmation. A reminder that Black faith survived the chains, the fires, the lies, and it remains alive. Afro fashion has also become a tool of empowerment. Head wraps, patterned fabrics, large earrings, braids, dreadlocks, everything that was once hidden is now proudly displayed as a symbol of pride and ancestry. The Black body, so often eroticized or criminalized, is now valued as an expression of strength, beauty, and originality. And most importantly, by Black people themselves. The gaze has changed. The narrative has changed. The control of one's own image now belongs to those who were always portrayed by other hands. In education, the progress has been slow but visible. Law 10,639, enacted in the year 2003, made the teaching of Afro-Brazilian history and culture mandatory in schools. Although it is still poorly applied in many places, it has opened space for Black children to, for the first time, see themselves in textbooks, in classrooms, and among the heroes. Knowing that names like Luisa Mahin, Dandara dos Palmares, Carolina Maria de Jesus, Lélia Gonzalez, Abdias do Nascimento, Milton Santos, and many others exist is essential to rebuilding the collective self-esteem of a people that was taught to hide. The contemporary Black movement is diverse, well-organized, and present on all fronts. Art, politics, science, entrepreneurship, media, spirituality. It no longer speaks only of resistance. It speaks of the future. A future where being Black does not mean fighting to survive, but living fully. Where Black people are not only remembered for suffering, but celebrated for their achievements. Where African names are not corrected, but respected. where Brazil recognizes that its soul has color, and it is black. African spirituality has also gained new strength, not only in toreros, but in meditations, in rituals of reconnection with the orixás, and in honoring the ancestors. For many, returning to spiritual roots is more than a belief, it is a reunion. It is reclaiming the lost link between past, present, and destiny. It is knowing that behind every silenced African name was a story, a clan, a people. And honoring that lineage is an act of collective healing. Historical memory is also being urgently rebuilt. Afro-Brazilian museums, memory tourism routes, audio-visual productions, books, podcasts, exhibitions, all of these have been used to show that the history of Brazil can no longer be told without Africans and their descendants. They were not side characters, they were protagonists. And their stories must be present in palaces, in classrooms, in school curricula, and on movie screens. But this reconstruction is not just symbolic, it is vital, because a people who do not know their origin repeat the mistakes of those who oppress them. That is why every space conquered is a form of reparation. Every voice that rises is a piece of truth restored, and every black child who grows up knowing they are beautiful, strong, and capable is a cry of victory that echoes from the slave ships to this very day. This is the true revolution: to exist with pride, to love your own skin, to honor your own story, to build your own path. And that brings us to the final point of this journey, the invitation for Brazil to look directly at its past, to recognize its debts, and finally begin walking toward a future of justice and equality. In the conclusion, we will close this cycle with a call to action, because telling this story is the first step. The next one depends on all of us. They crossed the ocean in chains. They were sold, whipped, erased from history, but they never ceased to exist. The 5 million enslaved Africans who arrived in Brazil were not just victims, they were builders. With wounded hands, they built cities. With tired feet, they opened paths. With broken bodies, they created culture. And with souls in resistance, they kept alive a flame that no chain could extinguish. Slavery shaped the foundation of Brazil. It is in the white surnames of the elite, in the landholding structures, in social inequalities, in the lack of opportunity, in the silence imposed on black voices. But now, the story is being retold, and every word spoken is a piece of justice rebuilt. It's not just about remembering the past, it's about recognizing that it still lives on. In structural racism, in exclusion, in daily prejudice. But it also lives in the strength of black mothers, in the wisdom of the toreros, in the beauty of black bodies that now proudly occupy the spaces once denied to them. If this video moved you, made you think, outraged you, or inspired you, don't let that feeling fade. Share it, comment, spread this truth that was hidden for centuries, and most importantly, listen, learn, respect, and rise. Because as long as there is silence, there will be erasure. And as long as there is resistance, there will be hope. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and help keep this memory alive. Brazil will only be truly free when all of its children are equally recognized.